Thank you for joining us. It's time for a cup with the chaplain, and I'm glad you're with us, whether it's morning, noon, or night. We've been getting some reports from a number of different places around the world, and I'm glad you're with us. We're going to speak a little bit to chaplaincy, a little bit to our inmates, those that are halted, and as well you that might be at home. I'm going to an obscure text in Job chapter 28, verse 10. And this has been resonating with me this past week. And I know I've touched on it before. Those that have listened to me speak live a few times know that this text means a lot to me, introduced to me by a very dear friend that went through a very difficult time. But it says in Job, in the King James, it refers to metaphorically God and says in the 28th chapter, verse 10, he cuts out channels in the rocks, and his eyes see every precious thing. I like another version, the English version says, he tunnels through the hard places and sees the treasure therein. And it refers to the ability that God has to tunnel into some difficult places. Now, I can't think of some more difficult places than what some of us have been through with this COVID. And I got to be quite honest with you, I can't wait to forget 2020. There's been nothing normal. We call this the new norm, but there's been nothing normal about it. And for many of you, it's been a very difficult time. So I want to give you a little inspiration from Job 28:10. He tunnels through the hard places. Now, I don't know how hard your place is right now, but many people do it, and it's not always just physical, but financial, emotionally, spiritually. And so I was thinking of 1 Kings 18. If you think in the Bible of places that have been hard, especially like a cave or a tunnel or something like that, and you can't help but get past David in the cave of Adullam, but you also have to remember that that's a place where God called his mighty men from. But then you go on and you get into 1 Kings 19, and it's one of the classic stories, and especially in regards to God meeting somebody that was in a cave or in a tunnel, if you would. And God is directing Elijah to go to a place where there are caves. And he directs them there after the 18th chapter of 1 Kings, where Elijah has this monumental event happen on Mount Carmel, and God answers his prayer by fire, brings fire down. And then the king and the queen, especially Jezebel, calls for Elijah's head. Well, he killed all the Baal prophets. She was kind of fond of them. That's the way she rolled. And so now she's going after Elijah. And so he takes off running and he hides. And an angel comes to feed him. And long story short, they get to the 11th verse. And there's this verse that says, then he said, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces. Now, I've been in some big windstorms, but I haven't seen the wind break rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind, and after the wind, an earthquake. And I've been in some really good earthquakes, especially at the Atwood building on the 18th floor. If you want to go through a really nice time in an earthquake, get up high. And it compounds the shaking. But after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. And so it was when Elijah heard that he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. Suddenly a voice came to him and said, what are you doing in here, Elijah? I love the way God can speak right to us. And he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, because the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left. And they seek to take my life. Well, then the Lord said, go and return, and begins to give them some instruction. I don't want to get ahead of this too much, but there's some really cool things about this And it all starts with God calling the cave dweller out, and says, come out and stand. And so he does. And so as Elijah's in there, he finds that God has tunneled into his life and is meeting him right where he's at. So he's a cave dweller in verse 9. It makes mention of that, verse 11. And then verse 10, he tries to justify that he's the only one left, and he reiterates that again in the text that I read to you, when he says in the 14th verse that I'm the only one left. He's a cave dweller. He's a cave justification person. And then he's going to get some cave orders. And God says to him, you go and you anoint the king of Syria and you anoint the king of Israel. And then this is where it really gets rough on Elisha. It's the last time he's going to go in a cave and say, God, I'm all you got left. Better deal good with me. He says to him, you're going to go and you're going to anoint your successor. It's amazing how God finds the cave dweller. The cave dweller tries to justify his actions, but God calls him out and gives him these orders and makes them so specific. He even names who Elijah's successor is going to be. And you'll remember, if you remember for 2 Kings, that Elijah tries to shake Elisha away from him and can't do it. And because Elisha somehow has gotten the same word that he needs to see Elijah go up. And so the bottom line is that God gets very specific and meets our need right where we're at, and does it. These were hard things for Elijah, to return to where he knew they wanted to kill him. You're not having a good day when you know your enemies want to kill you, and God says, I want you to go back, and I want you to do some things and to finish the task. And by the way, you're going to anoint your successor. So he gives them these cave details, I call them. And one of the cool things in that cave detail part is verse 18 of 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 18. He says, yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. Elijah had said, I'm the only one you got left. I'm all there is. They killed everybody else. And God says, as a caveat to the rest of the material, just as an addendum on the end, he says to him, I got 7,000 you don't have a clue about. And sometimes when we're stuck in our cave, we can't see anybody else, and we think we're the only ones. And I'm here to tell you, we're not the only ones. It's amazing to me how God does this, how he has people set up. And the minute we think we're alone, even Paul, when he was struck down on the road to Damascus, God had a person ready to minister to him, all lined up on Straight Street. And he had to go there and deal with his feelings toward Paul. But it's amazing to me that God has people you don't have a clue about. I like what the book of John says, probably in about the 6th chapter. It says, and there were other little ships. And it's always been kind of reflective of God has some people out there you don't have a clue about. And the moment you think you're all alone, the moment you think you're the only one going through your turmoil, there are others. I heard a great story about a lady that went through just a literal hell after her husband was arrested, and the church just blackballed her and sent her down the road, and she was just in a tailspin with 4 boys, and the last one had all kinds of medical issues, was a very high needs, was weighed 10 pounds at the age of 2. And she was trying to struggle, and her IRS bill, she told me that was several $1 million, like $15 million, and her husband's in jail, and child has high needs, and she can't find work. And finally a church hired her, and She began to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and it was not a train, but it was the Lord calling her out. But in the midst of your trial, you think you're the only one. You think you're in a hard spot. And granted, there are some difficult situations. And like in prison, you may think you're the only one going through what you're going through. But I guarantee you, there is nothing uncommon to man that someone else hasn't experienced or gone through. And God tunnels into those places. And he is able to find even the treasure there, the 28th chapter of Job, verse 10. He finds the treasure there. And if he can find the treasure in us, how great does that make us feel when God can do something with us, even if we're behind bars, or if our spouse is behind bars, or we're way in debt and have no promise for tomorrow? That's a tough place. It's a tough place to drill. But God tunnels through the hard places and tunnels into Elijah's life and calls him out and gives him specific instructions. There are very few times in my life that God ever gave specific instructions like that. Like Noah having the dimensions for an ark that he had never experienced, never seen, didn't know anything about building. And God gave him specific instructions. And in the midst of your hard place, God can give you specific instructions. I fast forward this just a little bit. I want you to be assured. Be assured that God knows right where you're at. Be assured that God has a plan for your life. I just want you to I want to know, above all else, do you know that God has a marvelous plan for your life? And be assured that he can tunnel through the hard places. You may be between a rock and a hard spot. God can tunnel right through that. Hey, if he can send a wind to break up the rocks, he can tunnel through your hard places and meet you right where you're at and begin to expose a marvelous plan for your life. God knows where you're at, and he's ready to meet you. I love the story, especially in Mark chapter 5, when the Gadarene comes out to encounter Jesus. And Jesus speaks into his life, and you know that story probably as well as I do, that there are legions of demons in this Gadarene, and chains can't hold him down, and he lives in what the Bible calls tombs. Those are worse than a tunnel. I mean, there's carcasses in there. And God calls him out, and Jesus meets him right where he's at and begins to speak into his life, and he casts the demons into the sea. And I love the end of that text. It's marvelous. If you haven't read it lately, go back and reread it. It's just too good to pass up, and I'm moving quickly to it. But all the way at the end of that story in Mark chapter 5, the Gadarene goes down with Jesus, and he wants to get in the boat and go with the disciples and all of that in the 18th verse. And when he got into the boat, speaking about Jesus, he who had been demon-possessed begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus has a mission plan for the Gadarene. He says, go home to your friends and tell them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he has had compassion on you. And he departed and began to proclaim in Decapolis all that Jesus had done for him, and all marveled. One version says he wrote these things or published them and started a book ministry, I'm sure. But I love the Gadarene's response to what Jesus told him to do. He was obedient, and he began to do it, even though he wanted to go. Listen, if there was probably no person, you could say that the same story is told in Matthew chapter 9, but in that chapter you also have the leper, and you have Peter's mother-in-law healed, and you have a number of other things that are spoken of that are healed. And, when people are going through a hard time physically, emotionally, spiritually, it's amazing how Jesus comes alongside, tunnels through those hard places, and begins to meet those needs. So my prayer is for you today. Lord, I pray that everyone within the sound of my voice, as we just share this cup together, I pray that we also share in this prayer that you meet needs in some really hard places, some really dark places. If somebody listening to this is in a cave, if somebody's in a tomb, if somebody's in a place between a rock and a hard spot and they can't find their way out, I pray that you meet them right where they're at. begin to share with them that you know right where they're at and that you have a plan for their life. And you want to speak into their life. Let your word come alive to them. Let, Lord, your spirit begin to rejuvenate them, and let them begin to experience transformational power of God in the midst of a hard place. God bless you.